My husband brought a woman from Germany to dinner and discussed my death right in front of me. He had no idea I understood every word. He spoke of my death in a language he believed I wouldn't understand, sitting right there at the dinner table. But when you've spent a lifetime dissecting words, sometimes silence speaks volumes, and hidden meanings reveal the most dangerous truths. It was a language he knew, but a language I knew even better. My phone lay innocently face down beside my dessert plate when Julian, my husband, leaned conspiratorially towards our guest and shifted into German. It was casual, unhurried, the German of a man utterly convinced no one at the table could follow along. He'd done his due diligence, I was sure, checking for any German speakers with the meticulousness of someone testing a locked door before whispering secrets. He had used this particular door before, always finding it reliably closed. But this time, he was terribly, fatally wrong. I poured more wine, my hands steady, betraying nothing of the tremor that seized my heart. He informed her the pills were already in circulation, setting a timeline of just 2 days. Everything I had inherited, every asset tucked away within what he called the Aldine Trust, a name that existed in no public record, a name I had never once heard him utter, would finally be where it belonged. Lena responded in the measured tone of someone confirming a transaction, devoid of enthusiasm or guilt. It was the flat, professional register of a logistics expert finalizing details. I absorbed every word my husband spoke about my impending demise, my mind fully comprehending, sharpened by a life devoted to the intricate dance of language. When he concluded, I gently set my glass down. I looked not at Julian, but directly at Lena, and spoke in impeccable German. There's a profound difference between being calm and being foolish, I stated. And that's a lesson you should have learned before signing your name to those filings. For precisely 3 seconds, Lena Schmidt's professional composure held. Then, something flickered behind her eyes. It wasn't fear, nor was it guilt. It was the specific, unsettling rearrangement of a person who suddenly realizes the room they occupy is not the room they thought they were in. Julian, across the table, went utterly still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the absolute frozen quiet of a man whose entire carefully constructed world has crumbled in a single sentence, leaving him standing amidst the wreckage, utterly speechless. I picked up my handbag. I rose unhurriedly. And I walked out of that restaurant, without once glancing back at either of them. My phone had been recording for 47 minutes. I am a professor of linguistics. For 2 decades, I've dedicated my life to studying how people manipulate language to mask their true intentions. The subtle chasm between the word chosen and the word available, the intricate grammar of concealment, the distinctive cadence of someone speaking in a register they believe to be private. I chair the Department of Applied Linguistics at a prominent research university in the Pacific Northwest. I've authored 4 books. I speak 7 languages fluently and 3 more well enough to follow a dinner conversation. Julian knew I studied languages, he had known this for 12 years. He had simply, and this is the most extraordinary thing to me, the detail I've replayed countless times in the months since, he had never truly considered what that meant. He assumed that studying language was a detached, academic pursuit, a collector's hobby. He imagined I gathered words like artifacts, cataloging them behind glass, labeled, preserved, and utterly separate from the person doing the collecting. He never grasped that fluency isn't merely a skill, it is, quite simply, another room you inhabit. You don't study your way into it any more than you study your way into your own kitchen. You just instinctively know where everything is. He operated under that assumption for 12 years. And he made it for the very last time that Thursday evening, over salmon and a bottle of Gruner Veltliner he'd carefully chosen to compliment his guest. My name is Adeline Hayes. I am 46 years old. I have been married to Julian Hayes for 12 years, which is the exact amount of time it took me to finally comprehend something I perhaps should have understood far sooner. The most perilous person in a marriage isn't the one who shouts, but the one who never does. Julian Hayes never once raised his voice at me, not in 12 years. This composure was something people often remarked upon, his unwavering steadiness, the measured quality of his responses, the way he navigated difficulties with an equanimity that others admired and that I, for 10 years, found deeply reassuring. What I now understand is that such equanimity always has a source. It can spring from genuine peace. But it can also stem from the unwavering conviction that you are entirely in control of every outcome. Julian's equanimity had such a source. I just hadn't discovered what it was yet. I want to tell you about the morning I finally understood, because that morning is where this story truly begins. And because, from the outside, that morning seemed utterly unremarkable, just as all truly significant mornings often do. For 5 years, I had been immersed in a project analyzing how pharmaceutical terminology migrated across different language families. I studied the journey of drug names, dosage instructions, and clinical registers as they traveled between French, English, German, and the Romance languages, seeking to understand what these movements revealed about how different cultures perceived illness and its treatment. It was a niche project, one Julian, when I attempted to explain it, found politely uninteresting, a category he reserved for most of my academic pursuits. 3 weeks before that fateful dinner, I returned home from a faculty meeting at 6:15 p.m. The house was quiet, save for Julian's voice, emanating from his study, the door almost closed. He was speaking French. I want to be precise about what I heard, because precision is my trade. Accumulation, dosage, remplacer, beneath those words, the distinct register of pharmaceutical French. Not the French of a casual traveler, a tourist, or even a well-educated conversationalist, but the French of someone deeply engaged in technical research. The specialized vocabulary of a person who had been meticulously poring over clinical documentation. Then, he laughed, an easy, unguarded sound. The laugh of a man who believes he is utterly secure. I walked to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea. When he emerged 20 minutes later, I was engrossed in a book at the counter, displaying the particular absorbed stillness Julian had come to associate with my work, which he interpreted as, "She's not paying attention to me." "Good meeting?" he inquired. "Productive," I replied. He poured himself a glass of water and settled in front of the television. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened a document on my laptop. I typed every word I'd heard, the French vocabulary, the specific register, the precise time of 6:15 p.m., the date, and the unguarded laugh. This became page 1 of a dedicated folder. The second crucial event occurred 4 days later. I had been taking thyroid medication for 6 years, a straightforward maintenance prescription, same dosage, same pharmacy, same routine. My endocrinologist, Dr. Evelyn Reed, described my condition as well-managed, which is clinical shorthand for everything's fine as long as you take your medication correctly. That Tuesday morning, I picked up my pill bottle as I always did. I held it in my palm before opening it, and something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not a thriller movie wrong where the label is obviously fake or the bottle conspicuously altered. This was the wrongness of expertise. The specific, microscopic knowledge that accumulates when you've performed the same tiny action, in the same way, for 6 years, and then, one day, that small thing is subtly different. The discrepancy registers before you can even articulate it. I opened the bottle, took out a tablet, and held it up to the lamp. The coating was marginally off, a slight variation in the matte finish, and the weight. I placed the tablet in my palm, and it wasn't right. Not dramatically incorrect, just fractionally so, in the way that close and exact are separated by a distance invisible to most, yet starkly legible to those trained to perceive it. My entire career has been spent in that precise space between close and exact. That, I know, is where the truth resides. I returned the tablet to the bottle, positioning it at the exact same angle, the same distance from the opening, the same placement relative to the others. I put the bottle back on my nightstand, precisely where it always sat. Then, I made 2 calls. The first was to Dr. Nolan Brooks, my colleague in the pharmacology department. 17 years in pharmaceutical chemistry, a man with the unique patience of someone who has spent his career examining infinitesimally small details for extended periods. I explained my observations. I told him I needed a discrete analysis, one that would not appear on any shared insurance records. He simply said, "Bring me 3 tablets. Don't tell me whose they are yet." The following morning, I brought him 3 tablets in a sealed envelope, along with a dated and signed chain of custody note. I knew what evidence required, even if I hadn't yet fully admitted to myself the kind of evidence I was gathering. My second call was to a pharmacy across town, a small independent one, chosen specifically because Julian had access to our shared insurance records through a financial dashboard he'd set up 3 years prior, which I had then found convenient and now viewed with chilling clarity. I explained to the pharmacist that I needed to fill my prescription with cash, without insurance, due to a privacy concern. She didn't ask any further questions. I transferred my prescription. That afternoon, I picked up my real medication, tucked into a small white bag, which I then locked away in a drawer in my university office. Dr. Brooks called me 4 days later. I was in my office, a student's paper on code switching in bilingual immigrant communities lying open before me, though I wasn't truly reading it. I hadn't really read much of anything in 4 days. Instead, I'd been performing reading, at dinner, in the evenings on the couch beside Julian, with the meticulousness of a woman who understood that the performance had to be absolutely convincing. "Adeline," Nolan began, "the tablets you brought me," a pause. It was the kind of pause that contains crucial information before the information itself arrives. "They are not consistent with your prescription. The active compound is present at approximately 40% of the labeled dosage. But there's a secondary compound I'll need to identify more specifically. I'd like to run a full panel." "Run it," I said. Nolan's voice shifted, a new undertone of gravity. "Adeline, is someone in your household accessing your medication?" I glanced down at the student's paper in my hands, at a sentence underlined in pencil, asterisk, "The speaker chooses the language of concealment when the language of disclosure becomes dangerous." Asterisk, "I'll explain once you have the full panel," I replied. I hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then I opened my laptop and added a new entry to my folder: date, time, content of call, Nolan's preliminary findings. That was entry number 7. I want to tell you about the 14 entries that followed, because they are the part of this story I've been most precise about, and I believe they are the most telling. Not for what each one states individually, but for what they reveal collectively. A concerned husband might remind you to take your medication. He might remind you twice if he's worried. He reminds you because he cares, because he loves you, because he wants your condition managed. What Julian was doing was different. He reminded me every single night, not with the anxiety of someone worried, but with the steady vigilance of someone monitoring a strict schedule. He would enter the bedroom at the same time each evening while I was reading, and he would say, softly, warmly, with the specific tenderness of a man playing a role, "Did you take your pill?" And I would say yes, because I had, just not the pill he was monitoring. He would nod, sometimes lightly touching my shoulder. And I would watch his face for the millisecond of satisfaction, a tiny tell I'd begun to notice, much like I'd noticed the subtle weight difference of the tablet. Not dramatic, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking, but undeniably present. 14 entries. 14 reminders. 3 weeks. Entry 8, Nolan Brooks' full panel results arrived. The secondary compound in the substituted tablets was identified as a sedative, a benzodiazepine derivative not present in any of my current prescriptions. It was present at a dosage that, taken nightly, would induce gradual cognitive slowing, pervasive fatigue, and, in combination with my existing thyroid condition, an accelerating physical decline that to any outside observer would appear to be a natural deterioration. I read the panel results in my office at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, my door closed, my phone off. I sat with the information for about 20 minutes. Then, I added entry 8 to the folder and called my attorney. Sarah Vance had been my attorney for 9 years. She handled my estate, my trust documents, my publishing contracts, and the various administrative structures of my academic career. She was 52, precise, and possessed the unique quality of someone who, over 24 years of practice, had heard many things and learned to receive all of them with the same calm, level-voiced attention. I recounted everything I had discovered. She remained silent throughout my full account. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have documentation of the medication discrepancy?" "Nolan Brooks panel results," I replied. "Dated and signed." "Chain of custody?" "Yes." "Good. What about the conversation you overheard in French?" "Documented in a time-stamped file from the same evening." "And the nightly reminders?" 14 entries, dates, times, exact phrasing. Another pause. "Adeline," she said, "I need to bring in someone else. I specialize in estate and civil law. What you're describing is criminal. Refer me to someone who handles this specifically," I instructed. "But Sarah, I need one more thing first. I need to understand this Aldine Trust." The name Julian used in French. The name I'd written on page 1 of my folder but couldn't locate in any public record, any filing I'd ever signed, any document within my own extensive estate files. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know that name," she finally said. "Neither do I," I replied. "That's the problem." She referred me to a trust specialist named Arthur Finch. 30 years in estate and trust law, a man whose name appeared in the acknowledgments of 2 academic texts on inheritance structure, a detail that spoke volumes about the caliber of person Sarah considered appropriate for my situation. I met with Arthur on a Thursday afternoon in his office, armed with copies of every trust document I had ever signed. He spent 2 hours reviewing them. "The Aldine Trust," he said at last, "does not appear in your filed documents. But the asset structure your estate employs, the way your inheritance is held, there is a provision in Section 14 of your mother's estate that would allow for a secondary beneficiary designation under a named trust. If someone had filed that designation without my knowledge, could they?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "Theoretically, with access to the original estate documents and a very good forgery." I thought of Julian's study, of the filing cabinet I had never felt the need to lock because I had never imagined needing to. I thought about how Julian, over 12 years, had managed certain administrative aspects of our household with an efficiency I had once found convenient, and now understood as strategic access. "How would we know?" I pressed. "I'd need to request the full estate record from the county registrar," he said. "And cross-reference it against what you have." "Request it," I told him. Entry 15. The dinner was Julian's idea. He mentioned it 2 weeks after I'd begun filling my real medication across town, 1 week after Nolan's panel results arrived, and 3 days after my meeting with Arthur Finch. "A colleague visiting from Germany," he'd said. Her name was Lena Schmidt, a professional contact, some vague consulting work he had explained. Over 12 years, I had learned not to press on Julian's vague professional references, they had a way of becoming clearer only in retrospect. I looked up Lena Schmidt. She wasn't difficult to find. A professional profile, a LinkedIn page, a clean and unremarkable digital presence that would have seemed entirely ordinary to someone not specifically looking for the thing I was looking for. I found it in 40 minutes, her listed specialty, international estate consulting, with a secondary practice in cross-border trust management. I added her name to the folder. Then I called Sarah's referred contact, the criminal attorney. His name was Samuel Thorne. He was 58, with 23 years in criminal law, 16 of them specializing in financial crimes. When I laid out the entire situation, the medication, the French conversation, the 14 reminders, the Aldine Trust, Lena Schmidt's specialty, He listened to everything before he spoke. "You're not going to the police yet," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No," I confirmed. "I need the dinner." He looked at me with the expression of a lawyer accustomed to clients making decisions he found professionally uncomfortable, but who had learned to distinguish between the dangerous choices and the strategic ones. "You understand that if your assessment of the medication is correct," he said carefully, "you are describing an ongoing attempt." "I do understand that," I replied. "I am also no longer taking the substituted medication. I have been taking my real prescription for 2 weeks. The decline Julian thinks he's monitoring is being performed." He held my gaze. "The dinner," he said. "The dinner," I affirmed. "If he confirms what I believe he is planning, I need it on record. I need him to say it. And if he does, my phone records audio. I need to know if that's admissible." Samuel Thorne spent 30 seconds staring out the window of his office. "In this state," he finally said, "one-party consent applies. You are a party to the conversation." "I know," I said. "I teach communication law as a secondary module. I just wanted your confirmation." He looked at me for a long moment. "Adeline," he said, "bring me the recording after the dinner. I performed the decline for 10 days. This is the part that people, when I've described it to the few friends I've confided in, find most remarkable. Not the medication discovery, not the meticulous legal preparation, but the performance itself. The slightly slower mornings, the fatigue I allowed to show at dinner, the subtle fogginess I permitted in my responses, not enough to alarm, just enough to confirm the trajectory Julian was watching for. I've spent 20 years studying performance. I know what it looks like from the outside. I know how to construct one that is internally consistent, that aligns with an observer's expectations, that creates the undeniable experience of witnessing something real. I presented Julian with a woman whose body was subtly losing a quiet battle. He watched, with the rapt attention of a man who held a significant stake in the outcome. Entry 21. Julian suggested at breakfast that I might consider reducing my teaching load this semester. I told him I was considering it. He touched my hand across the table in a way that, from the warmth in his eyes, he believed was compassionate. I thanked him. I then went to the university and taught a 2-hour seminar on the pragmatics of indirect speech acts with full cognitive clarity. The restaurant was his choice, French Mediterranean, a place we had visited 3 times before. In retrospect, I understood this as a strategic choice. Familiarity diminishes the perception of occasion. A dinner at a new restaurant signals importance. A dinner at a familiar restaurant implies, this is merely a Thursday. I wore a dress I had worn twice before. I arrived exhibiting the slightly distracted air of a woman managing low-grade fatigue. I ordered the salmon. I allowed Julian to order the wine. Lena Schmidt was already seated when we arrived. She rose as she saw us, medium height, late 40s, with the precisely groomed composure of a woman who views professional presentation as a discipline rather than a vanity. She shook my hand, her grip firm. Her English was excellent, carrying the slight flattening of vowels that German speakers often bring to English consonants. "Adeline," she said, "Julian has told me a great deal about your work." "That's kind," I replied. I placed my phone face down beside my dessert fork when we sat down, the screen angled slightly outward, precisely the way phones are positioned when their owners want to record discreetly. It is a functional setup that anyone who has conducted research interviews immediately recognizes. Lena Schmidt, I surmised, did not conduct research interviews. We had dinner. Julian was warm, engaging, and attentive, as he always was in the presence of people whose opinion of him mattered. He inquired about Lena's flight. He described my work with the affectionate vagueness of a husband who is proud without fully understanding. He topped up my wine with the solicitousness of a man tending to his wife. I watched the wine flow into my glass, keeping my hand perfectly still around the stem. The conversation flowed through dinner with the ordinary rhythms of a professional meal, light during appetizers, more substantive through the main course, settling into the comfortable depth of people who had accomplished their purpose by dessert. Then, Julian leaned slightly toward Lena, and switched to German. What he said, for the record that now exists in Samuel Thorne's files, in the county prosecutor's files, in the depositions I have since given, was this: the medication was in rotation and had been for 3 weeks. He expected the timeline to conclude within 48 hours. The Aldine Trust designation would activate upon my death, transferring the full value of my inherited estate to a structure in which Lena's firm held fiduciary responsibility. The arrangement had been filed 8 months prior, he elaborated, through a contact at the county registrar, a name I recognized from Arthur Finch's subsequent investigation as someone who had been quietly accepting payment for document irregularities for approximately 3 years. He was thorough. He was specific. He had clearly prepared this update as meticulously as any professional preparing for a meeting, organized, sequenced, covering all relevant items without unnecessary embellishment. Lena responded with the satisfied economy of someone neatly closing a loop, logistics confirmed. Timeline acceptable. She looked forward to a clean resolution. I poured more wine. My hand did not tremble. I want to be precise about this, because it is the question everyone asks: was I afraid? Was I devastated? Was I performing composure while something shattered beneath the surface? The answer is no. And not because I am inhuman. Not because I felt nothing. But because I had spent 3 weeks understanding what Julian was, which is a vastly different experience from understanding it all at once. The grief had arrived in measured installments, and by the time I sat across from him in that restaurant, I had already processed the worst of it. What I felt, listening to my husband calmly describe my death in careful German, was not surprise. I felt something I can only describe as completion. He had confirmed absolutely everything. I set my glass down. I looked at Lena, and I spoke. 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which Lena Schmidt's professional composure held, maintained only by sheer force of discipline, before something visibly shifted behind her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but the profound reordering of a person who has just realized the terms of the situation have changed without her knowledge, and that she is now in a room with a woman who has been listening, documenting, and meticulously preparing for this exact moment for 21 days. Julian. The stillness that enveloped him was the most absolute thing I have ever witnessed. Not shock, but something beyond it. The particular stillness of someone who has built an intricate structure and is now watching it collapse, caught in the millisecond between the fall and the impact, unable to formulate a response because the very premise for that response has been utterly obliterated. I picked up my purse. I stood without rushing. I walked to my car. Before I even started the engine, I made 3 calls. Samuel Thorne first. 23 years in criminal law. I told him the recording was complete, and that I would bring the phone to his office tonight. Tonight? He asked. It wasn't a question, but a confirmation. The timeline he described is 48 hours, I said. I want everything filed before morning. A pause. I'll be there, he affirmed. Dr. Evelyn Reed, my endocrinologist. 11 years as my physician, who received the call at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening with the contained professionalism of someone in medicine long enough to know that unusual calls at unusual hours contain unusual information. I told her about the medication substitution, about Nolan Brooks' panel results, about the compound identified. She was quiet through it all. I need a formal medical assessment of the impact of the substituted compound on your specific condition, she stated. Can you come in tomorrow morning? First appointment you have, I replied. Sarah Vance, my attorney, 3rd. 11 years. The Aldine Trust is real, I informed her. Arthur Finch confirmed the filing. Julian accessed the estate documents and had a designation filed 8 months ago through a compromised registrar employee. Adeline, her voice was the careful tone of someone prepared for a possibility now confirming it. I'm calling Arthur tonight. We'll have an emergency trust review filed before the county opens tomorrow. Good, I said. Julian's name illuminated my phone screen before I finished the third call. I watched it ring 7 times, then voicemail. Then again, 6 times. I drove directly to Samuel Thorne's office. The recording was in his hands before 10 p.m. The legal process that followed took 8 months, which is the unglamorous reality of justice in a complex financial and criminal case. Not a single dramatic courtroom moment, but a methodical sequence of procedural events, each one less cinematic than the last, each one profoundly necessary. The short version: Julian was arrested 19 days after the dinner. The charges included attempted murder, criminal poisoning, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The registrar's contact, whose name I won't include here as the case is ongoing, was arrested the same week on related fraud charges. Lena Schmidt's firm became the subject of an international legal inquiry that, from Samuel's updates, is steadily moving through jurisdictions that operate slowly and thoroughly. She was not in the country when the arrests were made. The Aldine Trust designation was voided. Arthur Finch spent 11 weeks meticulously untangling the specific mechanisms of the filing. What he uncovered, a secondary designation cleverly embedded within a provision of my mother's estate, which Julian had accessed through our shared document storage, was, in Arthur's professional assessment, the most sophisticated financial fraud he had encountered in 30 years of estate law. He conveyed this to me at our final meeting, with the slightly odd tone of someone describing a technical achievement they couldn't help but admire, despite its sinister purpose. He understood the structure very well, Arthur remarked. He's been looking at my documents for 12 years, I said. Yes, Arthur replied. That's how he understood it. Nolan Brooks' pharmacological analysis was entered into evidence as Exhibit C. Dr. Reed's medical assessment of the compound's impact on my thyroid condition was Exhibit D. My time-stamped folder, containing 21 entries spanning 3 weeks from the evening I first heard Julian on the phone in French to the night of the dinner, was Exhibit A. Samuel Thorne, presenting the evidence to the prosecutor, described it as the most methodically constructed personal documentation he had encountered in 23 years of criminal practice. I told him I had spent 20 years studying documentation. He said, "It shows." 6 months later, I am sitting in my office at the university, the early spring light streaming through the window. A student's dissertation lies open on my desk, and a cup of tea, which I made myself, warms my hands. The office bears the accumulated texture of 2 decades of work: the books, the manuscripts, the photographs from fieldwork in Paris, Berlin, and Kyoto.